So while I'm reading it,
Yeah.
uh, Elias
Mhm.
versus Oliver. Oliver is like what you would see a regular teen now versus like a teen back in like 1821. And the difference in society and how like men are. I had a lot of questions. I was thinking a lot about
Yeah.
like men and what does it mean to be a gentleman and what does it mean
Yeah.
today to be a gentleman. Because I read Elias's
Yeah.
letters and I'm like, this dude is desperate. This guy,
Yeah.
this guy right here. Oh man, sorry, dude, you would not cut it today. And like, it's interesting how
No.
society has changed
Yeah.
standards, and I just want to get
That,
your ideas
and
on that.
actually, I love that question. And when I was writing Elias, I mean, I knew I was like, okay, he's going to have to be flowery, which isn't truly realistic. I mean, you're probably one of the few guys who have picked up this book and have read it like cover to cover. I mean, it's for women. But one thing with writing for Elias, I wanted his struggle to really look at ideas of masculinity in Regency period.
Mhm.
And even to now, because I've had a lot of guy friends who I've sat down with and I've asked them, like, as I'm, what do you struggle with? I mean, girls, we have countless insecurities that are broadcasted all over the web. Everyone knows what women deal with. But I asked them, I was like, in this conversation, what do you struggle with? And a lot of them said that, especially growing up in the South, that they kind of struggled with this idea of masculinity. Like, could they express their emotions? How they didn't really know how to go about that without
Yeah.
seeming not manly. And so when writing Dearest Josephine, I wanted that to be a focal point of Elias, looking at the standards for men in the Regency period. If he's going through grief, is he using writing letters as a way to kind of process that? So even though he's technically writing to a girl, I wanted it more of he was using his letters to really process what he was going through in a safe space. I mean, I imagine his character that in person, he would be rather stoic and a little broody, and he wouldn't be as emotional as he is on the page. But that's the beauty of the written word. How we speak
Yeah.
isn't necessarily how we write. And so when looking at the idea of gentlemen, I mean, in the Regency time, gentleman was all about your class, your station. Are you a landowner? How much money do you have? Uh, do you work out in the fields versus do you sit at a desk? Do you, those sort of things. But I think in a lot of ways we've connected that to the character of a person, at least in today's era. If someone's like, he's a gentleman, I think there's more of a character connotation
So
with
gentlemen
that.
in the past used to be just like a station of
Yes.
life. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
So I mean, if, for example, if you've ever seen any period film, or you'd have two different types of men. You'd have the men walking around wearing work clothes, and you'd have the ones walking around in their tailcoat and cravat and their
Mhm.
pantaloons or something, and they'd be their trousers. And so it was that almost kind of like blue collar worker versus a desk worker. So it's kind
Yeah.
of that idea. So gentleman in the past was really focused on station versus today. I think it has more character connotations.
Yeah, I was very curious. So I'm sure you looked into this researching for the book, but like it's really interesting how like class structure
Yeah.
was back then. And it seemed like or the way it's kind of portrayed in the book is that
Yeah.
basically like your reputation was everything. It
Yeah.
wasn't really you made decisions based on what was best for your family and the social standing
Yes.
and the future. Um, so that was, I mean, and being a
Yeah.
bastard was like this like
Oh, and even in
heinous
the book,
scandal.
well, especially like being a illegitimate son, in that time period, if you were illegitimate, but you were the son of a farmer, it wouldn't have impacted you probably as much as it
Okay.
would have if you were the bastard of a titled gentleman. So in the book, Elias was able to keep his dad's title. In reality, he probably would have inherited the money, but wouldn't have been able to keep his father's title. So I stretched a little bit there just for the sake of fiction, but uh, back in that time period, especially like in the UK, really all across Europe, it was, I mean, status was everything,
Mhm.
reputation was everything, because it wasn't easy to rise in station. I mean, if you were born a maid, almost virtually impossible to end up the lady of a grand estate. So everything really revolved around your reputation in society. You know, were you well thought? How much money did you have? You know, what's your ancestry? I mean, you could
Mhm.
have a lot of money, but if you were quick money, for example, your father made a lot of money, but it wasn't old money. I mean, that was a kind of a different, uh, you know, you had different status there.
Mhm.
So really, the whole society revolved around who, like, whose child you were and how much money you had.
And it's challenging to take our contemporary view and put it back in
Yeah,
that place and try to understand
yeah.
why it was like that. Um, yeah, it was very what would you say? Is that static where it's like very hard to move up
I
or
would say
down?
so. Yeah.
Or it's
I
easy to
mean,
move down, I suppose, but not
I
up.
mean, you kind of see, I think a lot of that kind of goes back to the idea of the feudal system. I mean,
Yeah.
but you'd still have, even in Regency, you had lord and lady of a estate, you know, they'd be the lord and lady of like the village that they would do, you know, they would rent out their fields and things like
Mhm.
that. So it wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution where you started to
Yeah.
see that system start to unravel.
Mhm.
And people who were once titled, you know, their title meant nothing anymore. I think that kind of comes into even the early 1900s. You start to see that dissolve a little
So
bit
that's probably
more.
why you see we talked about earlier about gentlemen referring to character now, where I'm
Yeah,
sure the Industrial Revolution, now all of a sudden people who were lower in station had as much money as
yeah,
this gentleman. So
yeah,
now they were like, well, he's not a gentleman. His
yeah,
character is not the
yeah.
same as us or
So
something.
definition started, I think views and definitions started to change. And I think then it started to become easier to rise in station or to
Yeah.
alter your place in the world. But in Regency, that was, I mean, that was a huge focal point, especially if you were middle to upper class. I think that's what Jane Austen, a lot of her books, that's a similar theme. You know,
Hmm.
usually it's not the highest, you know, the richest or the, you know, most highest up in society. It's
Hmm.
a lot of her heroines tend to be right on the line where
Hmm.
they're not low class, they're kind of upper middle class and trying to rise in station, you know, save their family from poverty. And also back then, women didn't have any power. I mean, they
Yeah.
couldn't inherit their, let's say you had the oldest daughter, she couldn't inherit her father's property. You know, a lot of times it would go to either her husband or it would go to the closest male family relative. And so
Hmm.
back then marriage was the number one thing. That's all women were really could care about, is because their marriage determined
Hmm.
their future. So I think that that's another reason why status came from uh, money and title and all those things.
And so a lot of times too, they're marrying a man that they aren't in love with, and it's just for the family or whatever. So you're
Yeah,
stuck in this position where you can't like make your own money or
no,
inherit any money. You have to go with somebody else, but you probably don't love, or you might not love the
yeah,
man. He might be
yeah.
terrible. He might be, uh, and so there's like,
That's where the idea of you're doing it for your family is because
yeah.
how you're marrying determines really your family's future. I mean, if you are one of the only daughters, or you know, if you have all sisters, then if your father died, who would take care of your mom? Because the mom, you know, doesn't really have much money. So
Mhm.
it's a lot of times the marrying determined really the course of the family. If the other sisters weren't married, they'd be reliant on their older sister to marry well so that the husband would take care of the other sisters. So that's where a lot of the idle time came from. Is if you were a high born lady, and I guess if you weren't looking, I mean, if you weren't ready for marriage, I mean, I guess even once you were married, a lot of your time consisted of sitting in your drawing room.
Yeah. So what do women do in their
Yeah,
idle time during this period?
they, you know, needlepoint, work on their stitching, they paint, they play the pianoforte. So a lot of the arts, you know, they practice their French, learn how to sketch and watercolor. And that's the idea of the accomplished lady. The accomplished
Mhm.
lady would have been someone who was fluent in the arts. And so it would have been a big deal. If you were proficient on the pianoforte, if you were a talented artist, then that would have made you, I guess, revered more in society. They would practice their singing, things like that,
Okay.
walk around, be very ladylike. Really, that was the idea of femininity in that time period kind of came from showing the weakness of your sex, like as a woman. So some of the women,
Wow.
I read this little handbook that was from the Regency period for women about, you know, how to attract a man. And one of the
Yes.
advice,
Tell me how to attract
yeah, they said,
attract a man.
okay, to faint, to show that, you know, that you are weak, to faint near him. That was one of the things. You know, you throw your handkerchief down, which shows that you're interested. Things like that, things of that nature. Of course, you know, you'd sing, you'd invite him, you know, you'd hope he'd come and call on you, things like that. But my favorite was definitely just to faint in front of him, to show that you're delicate, you have delicate nature, just to faint.
Wow.
Just
So
imagine
it
that going down today. Girls, you know, they walk up to a guy and just pass out in front of him.
well, what's interesting though now too is like it- guys were it feels like it was a lot more structured, the courtship. Whereas
Oh
like
yeah,
today, I feel like if a woman tries to flirt or send signals,
yeah,
but young men were often very clueless and we don't get it.
yeah,
So then there's like this total like miscommunication and it's tough
yeah.
out here.
I mean, then it was, everything had to be chaperoned. So that was a huge deal because a woman's honor. I mean, the men could be sleeping around, no problem, but
Mhm.
as a woman, you didn't want to have your honor questioned. Like you never
Yeah.
wanted someone in society to say that, you know, you've been sleeping around or things like that. So chaperones were a must to preserve the honor, I guess, of the relationship. And so
Mhm.
women were very much censored. So a lot of the interactions between men and women happened at the parties. If you lived in the city, there would be a social season where you'd go to the different assembly halls, you'd go on your daily promenade through the park. And it was a very structured way of meeting people. If a man was interested in a woman, he could call on her, like in with her family. So he could call on her for afternoon tea, sit with the family in the drawing room. So it was very structured, just overall, and that's how you meet people. So I would say that it definitely a lot more rigid, I guess, than now.